My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how a room full of arrogant military officers learned that rank isn't always visible on your uniform. Sometimes it's earned through blood, sacrifice, and years of service they could never imagine. What happened that day in the Pentagon briefing room changed not only how those men saw me, but how the entire military establishment would view women in combat roles. I had been in the Army for 15 years, but you wouldn't know it from looking at me that morning. I was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple black pantsuit that I had bought off the rack at a department store, because I was officially on medical leave. 3 months earlier, I had been severely injured in an IED explosion in Afghanistan that had killed 2 of my soldiers and left me with shrapnel wounds, a traumatic brain injury, and PTSD that I was still learning to manage. The meeting I was attending wasn't supposed to be about me at all. I was there as a technical consultant, invited by General Patricia Hayes to provide insight on a new counterinsurgency strategy that was being developed for deployment in the Middle East. My experience leading special operations teams in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan and Iraq had given me expertise that was apparently valuable enough to bring me out of medical leave, but as I sat in that conference room, surrounded by 23 male officers ranging from major to brigadier general, it became clear that most of them saw me as an unwelcome intrusion into their boys' club. "Gentlemen," General Hayes announced as she entered the room, "I'd like you to meet our consultant for this project, Sarah Mitchell. She'll be providing operational insights based on her extensive combat experience." The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. I saw eye rolls, smirks, and the kind of dismissive body language that I had encountered countless times throughout my military career. Several officers exchanged glances that clearly communicated their skepticism about what a woman in civilian clothes could possibly contribute to their discussion of military strategy. "Ma'am," said Colonel James Bradford, a man I recognized as someone who had spent most of his career in administrative roles, "with all due respect, we're discussing highly classified operational matters. Are you certain that Ms. Mitchell has the appropriate clearance level?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He had deliberately used a Ms. instead of acknowledging any military rank, and his tone suggested that he viewed me as a civilian contractor rather than a fellow officer. "Ms. Mitchell has top-secret clearance and extensive field experience," General Hayes replied curtly. "She's here because she has operational knowledge that you need." But the damage was already done. The room's atmosphere had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed hostility. I could see it in their faces. They had already decided that I was out of place, that whatever I might contribute couldn't possibly be worth their time. Colonel Bradford wasn't finished. "General Hayes, I'm sure Ms. Mitchell is very qualified in her area of expertise. But we're developing strategies for active combat zones. Perhaps someone with more recent field command experience would be more appropriate?" The implication was clear. He didn't believe I had real combat experience, and he certainly didn't think I was qualified to advise on military strategy. Several other officers nodded in agreement, and I could hear whispered comments about diversity consultants and political correctness. I had faced this kind of discrimination throughout my career, but it never stopped being painful. These men were dismissing me without knowing anything about my service record, my combat experience, or the sacrifices I had made for my country. They saw a woman in civilian clothes and immediately assumed I was less qualified, less experienced, and less worthy of their respect. "Gentlemen," I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room, "I understand your concerns about my qualifications. Perhaps I should clarify my background." "That won't be necessary," interrupted Major General Robert Stone, a man whose chest was covered with ribbons that I knew represented mostly administrative achievements. "We're pressed for time, and we need to focus on the operational aspects of this mission." But I continued anyway. "I've served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. I've led special operations teams in counterinsurgency operations, hostage rescue missions, and direct action raids. I've been awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Action Badge." The room fell silent, but I could see that most of the officers remained skeptical. In their minds, I was probably exaggerating my experience or taking credit for achievements that belonged to the men under my command. Colonel Bradford leaned back in his chair with a smirk. That's impressive, Ms. Mitchell. But leading a support unit or serving in a logistics role isn't quite the same as commanding combat operations. His assumption that I must have served in a support role rather than direct combat was both infuriating and typical. Despite the fact that women had been serving in combat roles for years, many male officers still couldn't accept that a woman could be an effective combat leader. I wasn't in a support role, I replied evenly. I commanded Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. We conducted direct action missions against high-value targets throughout Afghanistan. This statement should have commanded immediate respect. The 75th Ranger Regiment was one of the Army's most elite units, and commanding a Ranger company in combat was an achievement that few officers could claim. But instead of respect, I saw doubt and continued dismissal. The Rangers don't have female company commanders, said Lieutenant Colonel Mark Thompson, stating what he believed to be a fact. They do now, I replied. I was the first. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the briefing materials. And General Hayes directed everyone's attention to the operational plans that needed to be reviewed. But throughout the next hour, as various officers presented their analysis and recommendations, I continued to face subtle and not so subtle signs of disrespect. When I raised questions about the proposed strategy, my concerns were dismissed or ignored. When I suggested modifications based on my field experience, I was told that the current plan had already been thoroughly vetted. When I pointed out potential problems with the intelligence assumptions, I was informed that the intelligence community had already confirmed the accuracy of their assessments. It was clear that these officers had no intention of seriously considering my input, regardless of my qualifications or experience. In their minds, I was an outsider who didn't belong in their discussion of serious military matters. The breaking point came when Colonel Bradford presented a tactical plan that I immediately recognized as fundamentally flawed. The proposed approach would put American soldiers at unnecessary risk by failing to account for the enemy's likely response patterns that I had observed firsthand during my deployments. Colonel Bradford, I said, I have serious concerns about this tactical approach. Based on my experience in similar operations, the enemy will likely respond by, Ms. Mitchell, Bradford interrupted, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but tactical planning requires understanding of military doctrine and operational principles that take years to develop. Perhaps you could focus on the cultural aspects of the mission, since that's more in line with your background. His dismissal was so blatantly condescending that several officers in the room looked uncomfortable. He was essentially telling me to stay in my lane and limit my contributions to stereotypically feminine areas like cultural sensitivity. My background, I said, my voice remaining calm despite my growing anger, includes planning and executing over 40 combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've seen what happens when tactical plans don't account for enemy response patterns, and I've lost soldiers because of poor planning. I'm sure you've seen a lot, Bradford replied with a patronizing smile, but there's a difference between following orders and making strategic decisions. Command responsibility requires a level of experience and judgment that he never finished that sentence, because at that moment, the conference room door opened and someone entered who would change everything. Attention, shouted someone near the door, and every officer in the room immediately stood and came to attention. I turned to see who had entered, and my heart nearly stopped. Walking into the room was General Michael Rodriguez, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He was a man I knew well, but whom these officers had never expected to see. General Rodriguez surveyed the room, his eyes moving from officer to officer until they found me. When our eyes met, his face broke into a smile of genuine warmth and respect. Sarah, he said, and his voice carried clearly through the silent room. It's good to see you. How are you recovering? The use of my first name, spoken with obvious familiarity and concern, sent a shock through the room. These officers were beginning to realize that I wasn't just some random consultant, I was someone who had a personal relationship with the most powerful military leader in the country. But what happened next was even more shocking. General Rodriguez walked directly to where I was standing, stopped in front of me, and did something that made every officer in the room question everything they thought they knew about me. He saluted, not a casual acknowledgement or a friendly wave, but a full, formal military salute, the kind of salute that a senior officer gives only to someone who has earned the highest levels of respect and recognition. And as he held that salute, he said words that would echo through that room and through the Pentagon. "For years to come, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, it's an honor to serve with you." The silence in the room was deafening. 23 male officers stood frozen in shock as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff held his salute, waiting for me to return it. The same men who had been dismissing me as an unqualified consultant just moments before were now witnessing the most senior military leader in America showing me the kind of respect typically reserved for war heroes and Medal of Honor recipients. So I returned General Rodriguez's salute, and as we both dropped our hands, I could see the confusion and growing realization spreading across the faces of the officers around us. Colonel Bradford, who had been so condescending just minutes earlier, looked like he had seen a ghost. "General Rodriguez," I said formally, "thank you for coming, sir." "Sarah," he replied, still using my first name in a way that emphasized our relationship. "I heard you were consulting on the new counterinsurgency strategy. I wanted to personally ensure that these gentlemen understand the value of your expertise." He turned to address the room, and his tone shifted from warm familiarity to the authoritative voice of command. "Gentlemen, I hope you've been giving Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell the respect and attention she deserves. Her operational experience and tactical insights are exactly what this project needs." The emphasis he placed on the Lieutenant Colonel was unmistakable. He was making it clear that I wasn't just Sarah Mitchell, consultant, I was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a senior military officer whose rank and experience demanded respect. "Sir," General Hayes interjected, "we were just reviewing the tactical components of the proposed strategy. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell has been providing valuable input." I appreciated General Hayes's attempt to smooth over the situation, but General Rodriguez had been in the military long enough to read the room. He could see the tension, the discomfort, and the obvious signs that I hadn't been receiving the respect I deserved. "I see," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "And what has been Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's assessment of the current tactical approach?" All eyes turned to me, and I realized that this was my moment. Not only to provide my professional opinion, but to demonstrate to these officers that their dismissive attitude had been a serious mistake. "Sir," I began, "I have significant concerns about the proposed tactical plan. The approach outlined by Colonel Bradford fails to account for the enemy's likely response patterns, particularly their use of secondary ambush positions and coordinated counterattacks." I moved to the tactical map displayed on the wall and began pointing out specific problems with the plan. Based on my experience conducting similar operations in Helmand Province, the enemy will likely respond to our initial assault by withdrawing to these positions. I indicated several locations on the map, where they can establish overlapping fields of fire and trap our forces in a kill zone. The room was completely silent as I continued my analysis, but now it was the silence of professional attention rather than dismissive disregard. These officers were finally listening to what I had been trying to tell them for the past hour. "Furthermore," I continued, "the intelligence assessment appears to underestimate the enemy's capability for rapid reinforcement. In my experience, they can move additional fighters into the area within 30 minutes of initial contact, which means our extraction timeline is unrealistic." General Rodriguez nodded approvingly as I spoke. "What would you recommend instead?" "Lieutenant Colonel?" "Sir, I would recommend a modified approach that accounts for these response patterns. We should plan for a longer engagement timeline, position additional support assets for rapid extraction, and consider alternative routes that avoid the most likely ambush positions." I spent the next 10 minutes outlining a comprehensive alternative strategy, drawing on specific examples from operations I had personally planned and executed. As I spoke, I could see the attitudes in the room shifting. The officers who had been dismissing me were now taking notes, asking clarifying questions, and treating my input with the seriousness it deserved. When I finished my presentation, General Rodriguez turned to address the room again. "Gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of operational expertise I was hoping Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell would provide. Her recommendations should be incorporated into the final tactical plan. Sir, Colonel Bradford said hesitantly, may I ask about Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's specific experience with these types of operations? It was a reasonable question, but the way he asked it suggested that he still harbored doubts about my qualifications. General Rodriguez's response would put those doubts to rest permanently. Colonel Bradford, General Rodriguez said, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell commanded the most successful Special Operations Company in Afghanistan during her deployment. Her unit conducted 43 direct action missions with a 100% success rate and 0 friendly casualties. The impact of this statement was immediate and profound. A 100% mission success rate with 0 friendly casualties was virtually unheard of in special operations. It represented a level of tactical excellence and leadership that few officers could claim, but General Rodriguez wasn't finished. She was personally responsible for the capture or elimination of 12 high-value targets, including the operation that led to the death of Ahmad Shah Massoud, one of the most wanted terrorist leaders in Afghanistan. I saw several officers exchange glances of shock and recognition. The operation against Ahmad Shah Massoud had been widely reported in military circles as one of the most successful special operations missions of the war. The fact that I had led that mission immediately elevated my credibility to a level that couldn't be questioned. Additionally, General Rodriguez continued, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was awarded the Silver Star for her actions during the rescue of American hostages in Iraq. She personally led a team into a heavily defended compound, eliminated multiple enemy combatants, and successfully extracted 3 American civilians who had been held captive for 6 months. The Silver Star was the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. It was an award that commanded immediate respect from any military professional, and the fact that I had earned it for a hostage rescue mission demonstrated both my combat leadership and my willingness to risk my life for others. Colonel Bradford looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The same woman he had been dismissing as unqualified just an hour earlier was revealed to be one of the most decorated and successful combat leaders in the modern military. Sir, said Major General Stone, we had no idea about Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's background. We apologize for any misunderstanding. The misunderstanding, General Rodriguez replied sharply, is that you made assumptions about Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's qualifications based on her appearance rather than her service record. That kind of thinking has no place in the modern military. The rebuke was clear and deserved. These officers had allowed their prejudices to cloud their professional judgment, and they had been called out by the highest-ranking military leader in the country. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, General Rodriguez said, turning back to me, I understand you're still on medical leave. How are you feeling? I'm recovering well, sir, I replied. The doctors expect me to be cleared for full duty within the next month. Excellent. When you're ready to return to active duty, I want you to consider a position on my staff. We need officers with your experience and expertise to help shape our future operational strategies. The offer to join the chairman's staff was an extraordinary honor that represented the pinnacle of military career advancement. It was the kind of opportunity that most officers could only dream of, and General Rodriguez was offering it to me in front of a room full of senior officers who had been questioning my qualifications just minutes earlier. Sir, I would be honored to serve on your staff, I replied. Outstanding. General Hayes will coordinate the details with you. He turned to address the room one final time. Gentlemen, I expect Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's recommendations to be fully incorporated into the final operational plan. Her expertise could save American lives, and that should be your primary concern. With that, General Rodriguez headed toward the door, but he paused before leaving. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, walk with me for a moment. I followed him out of the conference room and into the hallway, where he stopped and turned to face me with a concerned expression. Sarah, he said quietly, I'm sorry you had to deal with that kind of treatment. It's unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on the leadership in that room. Sir, it's nothing I haven't encountered before, I replied. Unfortunately, it's still a common experience for women in the military. That needs to change, he said firmly. Officers like you have proven that gender has nothing to do with combat effectiveness or leadership ability. The men in that room learned an important lesson today, and I intend to make sure that lesson spreads throughout the military." He was right. What had happened in that conference room was about more than just my personal experience. It was a microcosm of the broader challenges that women faced in the military. The assumption that women were less qualified, less experienced, or less capable of leadership in combat situations was still prevalent, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "Sir," I said, "I appreciate your support. It means more than you know. You've earned it, Sarah. Your service record speaks for itself, and any officer who can't see that is failing in their duty as a leader." As we walked back toward the conference room, I reflected on what had just occurred. In the span of 30 minutes, I had gone from being dismissed as an unqualified consultant to being offered a position on the chairman's staff. The same officers who had been questioning my right to be in the room were now hanging on my every word, but the most important thing that had happened wasn't the validation of my qualifications or the recognition of my achievements. It was the demonstration that prejudice and assumptions had no place in professional military discussions. The officers in that room had learned that rank, experience, and expertise couldn't be judged by appearance, gender, or civilian clothes. When we returned to the conference room, the atmosphere was completely different. The officers who had been dismissive and condescending were now respectful and attentive. They asked thoughtful questions about my recommendations, incorporated my suggestions into their planning, and treated me as the senior military professional that I was. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, and by the end, we had developed a comprehensive operational plan that incorporated the lessons I had learned from years of combat experience. It was a plan that would be more effective, safer for American troops, and more likely to achieve its objectives. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out of the room, Colonel Bradford approached me with an expression of genuine remorse. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," he said, "I owe you an apology. My behavior today was unprofessional and inappropriate. I made assumptions that were completely wrong, and I'm embarrassed by my conduct." "Apology accepted, Colonel," I replied. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them." But as I watched him leave, I knew that the real lesson of that day extended far beyond one officer's apology or one successful meeting. It was a lesson about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize the true qualifications and contributions of every service member, regardless of their gender, background, or circumstances. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office in the Pentagon, wearing the uniform of a full colonel, a promotion that had come through faster than anyone expected, largely due to General Rodriguez's recommendation and the success of the operational plan we had developed that day. The mission in Afghanistan had been executed flawlessly, with 0 American casualties and complete achievement of all objectives. The tactical modifications I had suggested had proven crucial to the mission's success, but the real impact of what had happened in that conference room extended far beyond a single successful operation. The story of how a room full of senior officers had dismissed a decorated combat veteran based on gender assumptions had spread throughout the Pentagon and beyond, becoming a catalyst for broader discussions about bias, respect, and recognition. In the military, General Rodriguez had been true to his word about ensuring the lessons spread throughout the military. He had used the incident as a case study in leadership training programs, emphasizing the importance of evaluating people based on their qualifications and achievements rather than their appearance or demographics. The Mitchell incident, as it had come to be known in military circles, had become required reading at the Army War College and other senior military education institutions. It was being used to teach future military leaders about the dangers of unconscious bias and the importance of creating inclusive environments where all qualified personnel could contribute effectively. The changes weren't just theoretical. In the months following the incident, the Army had implemented new policies requiring that all personnel files and service records be reviewed before any strategic planning meetings. Officers were now required to be briefed on the qualifications and experience of all participants, regardless of their current duty status or appearance. More importantly, the military had begun actively addressing the cultural attitudes that had led to my dismissal in the first place. New training programs focused on recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias, and senior leaders were being held accountable for creating inclusive environments in their commands. I had received dozens of letters from female service members who had heard about the incident and wanted to share their own experiences with discrimination and dismissal. Many of them described similar situations where their qualifications had been questioned or their contributions had been minimized because of their gender. Colonel Mitchell, wrote Captain Jennifer Walsh, a combat engineer serving in Iraq, "Your story gave me the courage to speak up when my male colleagues were dismissing my recommendations about bridge construction in our area of operations. When I insisted that my engineering degree and construction experience qualified me to make those assessments, they finally listened. The bridge we built using my specifications has become a crucial supply route for our forces." Another letter came from Major Lisa Rodriguez, a military intelligence officer. "I was in a briefing where male officers were ignoring my analysis of enemy movement patterns, even though I had been tracking these specific units for 6 months. I thought about your experience and decided to be more assertive about my expertise. My analysis turned out to be correct and helped prevent an ambush that could have cost American lives." These stories reinforced my belief that the incident in the Pentagon had been about more than just my personal experience. It had highlighted systemic issues that affected women throughout the military, and the attention it had received was helping to create positive changes for female service members at all levels, but perhaps the most significant impact was on the officers who had been in that conference room. Colonel Bradford, in particular, had undergone what could only be described as a complete transformation in his approach to leadership and personnel evaluation. He had requested a meeting with me a few weeks after the incident, during which he had made a remarkable admission. "Colonel Mitchell, that day in the conference room was a wake-up call for me. I realized that I had been making assumptions about people's qualifications based on superficial characteristics, and that those assumptions were affecting my ability to be an effective leader." Bradford had gone on to become one of the most vocal advocates for gender equality and inclusive leadership in the Army. He had volunteered to lead training sessions on unconscious bias, and he had made it a priority to ensure that female officers in his command were given opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities and advance their careers. "I've learned that good leadership means recognizing and utilizing the talents of all your people," he told me during one of our follow-up conversations. Gender, race, age, or appearance have nothing to do with someone's ability to contribute to the mission. The operational success of the mission we had planned had also had lasting implications for how the military approached tactical planning. The modifications I had suggested, based on my combat experience, had become standard elements of similar operations. The lessons learned from that mission were being incorporated into training programs and operational doctrine throughout the Special Operations community. General Rodriguez had kept his promise about ensuring that my expertise was utilized effectively. As a member of his staff, I had been involved in developing new counterinsurgency strategies, improving special operations training programs, and advising on personnel policies that would better utilize the talents of all service members. Point 1. Of my most significant contributions had been the development of new protocols for incorporating combat experience into strategic planning. Too often, the military had relied on theoretical knowledge and academic study while overlooking the practical insights that could only come from actual battlefield experience. "Sarah," General Rodriguez had told me during one of our regular meetings, "your experience demonstrates the importance of having diverse perspectives in our decision-making processes. We can't afford to overlook qualified people because they don't fit traditional expectations." The changes weren't limited to the Army. The other service branches had taken notice of the Mitchell incident and had begun examining their own policies and practices regarding gender equality and inclusive leadership. The Navy had implemented new requirements for diversity in strategic planning committees, and the Air Force had created mentorship programs specifically designed to support female officers in combat roles. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had sparked broader conversations about the value of combat experience and the need to recognize and utilize the expertise of all qualified personnel. Too many decisions about military strategy and tactics were being made by officers who had never experienced combat, while the insights of combat veterans were being overlooked or undervalued. A year after the incident, I was invited to speak At the annual Association of the United States Army Conference, where I addressed an audience of over 3,000 military professionals about the importance of inclusive leadership and the value of diverse perspectives in military decision-making. The lesson of that day in the Pentagon, I told the audience, wasn't just about gender equality or overcoming bias. It was about the fundamental principle that good leadership requires recognizing and utilizing the talents of all your people, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. I continued, every person in uniform has something valuable to contribute to our mission. Our job as leaders is to create environments where those contributions can be recognized, valued, and utilized effectively. When we fail to do that, we are not just being unfair to individuals, we're compromising our ability to accomplish the mission and protect American lives. The response to my speech was overwhelmingly positive, and it led to invitations to speak at military installations around the world. The message was resonating with service members at all levels, from junior enlisted personnel to senior generals, but the most meaningful feedback came from the young female officers who approached me after these speaking engagements. They told me that my story had inspired them to be more confident in asserting their qualifications and expertise, and that they felt more empowered to challenge situations where their contributions were being overlooked or undervalued. Colonel Mitchell, said Second Lieutenant Maria Santos after one of my presentations at West Point, your story taught me that I don't have to accept being dismissed or underestimated. I have the right to demand that my qualifications and experience be recognized and respected. These conversations reminded me that the impact of that day in the Pentagon was still rippling through the military, creating positive changes for a new generation of female service members who would face fewer barriers and more opportunities than those who had come before them. Looking back on that day, I realized that the moment when General Rodriguez saluted me had been about more than just personal vindication. It had been a symbolic recognition of the contributions and sacrifices of all the women who had served in combat roles, often without receiving the recognition they deserved. The men in that conference room had learned an important lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance or gender. But more importantly, they had learned that effective leadership requires looking beyond surface characteristics to recognize the true qualifications and potential of every person. Under their command, the military was changing, slowly but steadily, and I was proud to have played a role in that transformation. The young women entering the service today would face a more inclusive and respectful environment than I had encountered when I first put on the uniform 15 years earlier. As I sat in my Pentagon office, looking at the photos on my wall from my deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, I thought about the soldiers I had led and the missions we had accomplished together. They had followed me not because of my gender or my appearance, but because of my competence, my dedication, and my commitment to bringing them home safely. That was the standard by which all military leaders should be judged, and it was the standard I would continue to uphold throughout the rest of my career. The day when a room full of officers mocked my rank had ultimately become the day when the military began to truly understand that leadership, courage, and expertise come in many forms, and that recognizing and respecting those qualities in all service members is essential to our mission and our values. The END warning. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and has been created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental.